Some films feel less like stories being told and more like ancient stones being uncovered, one layer of dust at a time, until something rough, strange, and half forgotten begins to breathe again. Welcome to the Cineflux, where cinema is not only something we watch, but something we sit with, question, return to, and sometimes carry around like a memory that does not belong entirely to us. And today, we are stepping into a film that feels carved out of myth, sweat, fire, violence, silence, and dream-like brutality. Conan the Barbarian, released in 1982. This is not a film that asks to be loved in a simple way. It does not reach out softly. It does not explain itself with modern comfort. It arrives like a blade laid on a stone table, cold at first, almost primitive in its confidence, and then slowly, strangely, it begins to reveal that there is more happening beneath its muscle and spectacle than many people remember. Because here is the thing about this film, it is easy to reduce it to an image. Arnold Schwarzenegger with a sword, a fantasy world of temples, deserts, cults, warriors, and blood, a barbarian myth built around revenge. But cinema rarely becomes memorable because of one image alone. It lasts when that image begins to hold feeling, and Conan the Barbarian holds a very particular feeling. It feels like a word before psychology had language, before trauma had vocabulary, before grief could sit in a room and explain itself. In this world, pain does not become conversation. Pain becomes muscle, it becomes movement, it becomes endurance. It becomes the way a man looks across a fire and says almost nothing, because whatever happened to him happened so early, so completely that language arrived too late to save him. That is what I keep returning to with this film. Not only the fantasy, not only the action, not only the strange, heavy atmosphere of its world, but the sense that this is a story about a human being shaped by violence long before he understands himself as human. Conan is not introduced to us as a polished hero. He is not elegant, not morally complex in the way modern protagonists are often written, not full of speeches about destiny. He is shaped like a myth because the world around him has denied him the softness of an ordinary life. And maybe that is why the film still has a strange power, even when parts of it feel rough, uneven, or distant from how fantasy cinema would later evolve. It is not trying to charm you. It is trying to immerse you in something older, harsher, more elemental. It wants you to feel heat, iron, hunger, fear, worship, revenge, and the terrible beauty of survival. Today, I want to sit with that experience carefully. Not just to ask whether Conan the Barbarian works as an adventure film, or whether its action still holds up, or whether its reputation is deserved. Those questions matter, but they are only the surface. I want to ask what this film understands about myth, what it understands about the body as a record of suffering, what it understands about power, devotion, manipulation, and the dangers humans need to believe in something greater than pain. Because this film does something rare. It takes a character who could easily have been only a physical presence and places him in a world where every object feels symbolic. A sword is never just a sword, a wheel is never just a wheel, a temple is never just a temple. Even silence feels like a kind of language, and when a film builds itself this way, it asks us to watch differently, not quickly, not casually, but almost like we are reading an old mural whose meaning has been damaged by time, where the missing pieces are part of the mystery. And of course, this is also a film of contradictions. It is grand and clumsy, beautiful and blunt, hypnotic in some moments, oddly stiff in others. It can feel deeply cinematic, then suddenly simple in a way that almost breaks the spell. It is filled with unforgettable atmosphere, yet not every character receives the same depth. It reaches for mythic greatness, but it also carries the limitations of its era, its genre, and its own imagination. That is why I think it is worth approaching with honesty rather than nostalgia. If we only praise it, we flatten it. If we only mock it, we miss what made it endure. The more interesting place is somewhere in between, where we can see the film clearly as a sword and sorcery landmark, as a star making vehicle, as a strange piece of early 1980s fantasy cinema, and as a work that understands mood sometimes more deeply than plot. My personal rating for this film is 6.4 out of 10, and that number matters because it reflects the tension of the experience. I do not see Conan the Barbarian as flawless. I do not think every part of it lands with equal force, but I do think it has something many cleaner films do not have. It has weight, it has identity. It has a world that feels imagined through stone, smoke, and ritual. It has a score that seems to rise from the earth itself. It has images that remain in the mind not because they are subtle, but because they feel mythic enough to survive their own rough edges. So, in this essay, we are going to move slowly through it. We are going to begin outside the film, in the world that created it, because no movie arrives from nowhere. Then we will move inward into the story, the performances, the craft, the silences, the flaws, the themes, the rewatch layer, the cinematic influences, and finally the full spoiler territory where the film's ending can be felt in its complete shape. And before we enter that world of steel, gods, serpents, grief, and fire, we have to understand the moment that made a film like this possible. Because Conan the Barbarian did not simply appear as a fantasy adventure, it emerged from a very specific cinematic hunger, a cultural mood that was looking backward into myth, while the modern world was becoming louder, faster, and more uncertain. To understand Conan, we first have to understand the world that was ready to dream him back into existence. The early 1980s were a strange time for fantasy to return with such force because the world outside the theater was not exactly innocent. It was not a time that felt soft or simple or free of anxiety. The late 1970s had left behind economic uncertainty, political exhaustion, cultural disillusionment, and a sense that old promises had either failed or become difficult to believe in. America, especially, was moving into a new decade with a desire for strength, order, spectacle, and mythic clarity. The world felt modern, but emotionally it was still haunted by older fears. And cinema, as it often does, began turning those fears into shapes we could understand. Think about what that means. When a culture feels uncertain, it often reaches backward. It goes looking for kings, warriors, prophecies, ancient gods, lost civilizations, and stories where violence has a visible form. Not because the past was safer, but because myth gives chaos a shape. Myth allows fear to become a monster. It allows pain to become a quest. It allows power to stand in front of us, wearing armor, holding a weapon, speaking in symbols instead of statistics. And that is the world Conan the Barbarian entered. By 1982, cinema had already been transformed by the blockbuster era. Jaws had changed the rhythm of popular suspense. Star Wars had changed the scale of imagination. Audiences had been reminded that movies could build worlds again, not just reflect the one outside the door. But there is a crucial difference between the fantasy of Star Wars and the fantasy of Conan. Star Wars looks outward into space, technology, rebellion, and spiritual adventure. Conan looks backward into earth, flesh, steel, and blood memory. One gives us stars, the other gives us stone, and that contrast matters. Because Conan the Barbarian arrives as a fantasy film that does not feel polished by wonder, it feels weathered. It does not imagine adventure as escape into brightness. It imagines adventure as survival inside a world where civilization is fragile, gods are silent, and strength is often the only language people respect. In that sense, the Finn belongs to the sword and sorcery tradition, but it also gives that tradition a cinematic body. It takes the pulp energy of Robert E. Howard's character and turns it into something slower, heavier, more ritualistic. This was also a moment when the action body was becoming one of cinema's great visual symbols. The late 1970s and early 1980s began preparing the ground for an era where physical presence could become mythology by itself. Before action heroes became quip machines, before the genre became defined by ironic distance, there was a fascination with the body as proof. Muscle became not just decoration but narrative. It suggested discipline, punishment, transformation, survival, and Arnold Schwarzenegger enters this film almost like an answer to that hunger. He does not perform Conan through psychological transparency. He performs him through shape, posture, stillness, weight. That could have filled completely. In another film, with another tone, it might have seemed empty. But here, in this specific cultural and cinematic moment, it becomes part of the point. Conan is not a man who explains his wounds. He is a body that has been forced to remember them. The film's world does not ask him to become articulate, it asks him to endure, strike, climb, run, suffer, and survive. And so the casting becomes inseparable from the era. Arnold was not simply playing a barbarian, he was becoming one of the decade's clearest symbols of physical will. At the same time, fantasy cinema itself was trying to find its modern screen language. The genre had always existed, but the early 1980s brought a particular wave of mythic and medieval imagination. Films like Excalibur, Dragon Slayer, and later The Dark Crystal and Legend show that filmmakers were searching for ways to visualize pre-modern worlds with new cinematic ambition. These films were not all doing the same thing, but they shared a hunger for texture. Armor, smoke, creatures, castles, caves, rituals, impossible landscapes. The screen was becoming interested again in the handmade dream. Conan the Barbarian sits inside that wave, but it is harsher than many of its neighbors. It is less enchanted. It does not have the moral brightness of a children's fairy tale or the clean nobility of high fantasy. Its world feels dangerous in a basic physical way. Even beauty in this film has danger in it. A temple can be seductive and terrifying. A landscape can feel vast and dead. A feast can feel like a trap. Power does not arrive with elegance. It arrives with domination, worship, and fear. And then there is the question of what people expected from a film like this. On the surface, it looked like fantasy action, a warrior's revenge story, a pulp icon brought to the screen. But the actual film was stranger than a simple adventure machine. John Milius directed it with a seriousness that can feel almost startling now. He treats the material not like camp but like legend. He allows the film to move at a heavy pace. He gives it long stretches where image and music carry meaning more than dialogue. He allows the world to feel ancient not because every detail is explained but because so much is left to be felt. That seriousness shaped the film's reception. Some critics saw its power, its visual ambition, and its mythic atmosphere. Others found it too brutal, too stiff, too blunt, too limited in character. And honestly, both responses make sense. This is the kind of film that almost invites division because its strengths and weaknesses are made from the same material. Its simplicity can feel elemental, or it can feel thin. Its silence can feel profound, or it can feel empty. Its violence can feel mythic, or it can feel heavy handed. Its performances can feel sculpture, or they can feel emotionally distant. That gap between admiration and criticism is part of why the film remains interesting. It was never only a clean critical darling, it was never only disposable entertainment either. It existed somewhere in the middle, where cult objects often begin their long second life. Audiences responded to its images, its scale, its atmosphere, and especially to Schwarzenegger's presence. Over time, it became one of those films whose reputation is not built only on reviews but on memory. People remembered the wheel, the sword, the cult, the music, the giant sadness behind Conan's eyes, even when the film does not ask him to explain it. Awards were not really the place where this film's legacy was measured. It was not the kind of movie designed to be embraced by major prestige institutions, and yet sometimes cinema history is unfairly narrowed when we only ask what won trophies, because certain films do not enter culture through awards, they enter through iconography. They enter through posters, VHS shelves, late night television, fan imagination, and the way a character becomes larger than the film around him. Conan the Barbarian belongs to that category. Its achievement is not that it became formally decorated. Its achievement is that it became instantly recognizable. The score is a major reason for that. Basil Polydoris created music that does not merely accompany the film, it gives the film its soul. Without that music, the world might feel too empty, too hard, too simple. With it, the images become ceremonial. The music understands what the dialogue often cannot say. It tells us that Conan's journey is not just about revenge. It is about a child being torn from one life and forged into another. It is about grief becoming destiny because nothing gentler was available. That scar gives emotional nobility to a world that might otherwise collapse into savagery. And this is where the film becomes more than just a product of its time. It is clearly of the early 1980s, with that decade's fascination with strength, myth, masculinity, spectacle, and survival. But it also reaches towards something older than its decade. The story is almost primitive in structure: family destroyed, child enslaved, body hardened, enemy pursued, power confronted, identity claimed. That kind of structure is ancient. It belongs to oral storytelling, to campfires, to legends repeated until they become less about plot and more about meaning. Still, we should not romanticize everything about the era that produced it. The film carries certain limitations in how it imagines women, power, culture, and desire. It sometimes leans into fantasy imagery without fully questioning. It sometimes mistakes intensity for depth, and as we move through the essay, those flaws deserve attention. But even those limitations are part of the historical texture. They show us what fantasy cinema was wrestling with at the time: how to turn pulp into myth, how to make physical spectacle feel serious, how to build words without drowning them in explanation. What makes Conan the Barbarian last is not that it solved all those problems. It did not. What makes it last is that it committed so fully to its own strange tone. It does not wink at you. It does not apologize for being grand. It does not soften its edges to become more broadly comfortable. It believes in the sound of drums, the glow of fire, the weight of steel, the terror of false prophets, and the loneliness of a man who has been shaped by forces he did not choose. So, when we look back at the world this film was born into, we see more than a fantasy trend. We see a culture reaching for myth in a time of uncertainty. We see cinema learning how to build blockbuster wars after Star Wars, but choosing here to build one out of mud, ritual, and pain, rather than lasers and stars. We see the rise of the action body as a cultural symbol. We see the beginning of Arnold Schwarzenegger as a mythic screen presence. And we see a film that understood, maybe more instinctively than intellectually, that modern audiences still needed ancient stories. Because sometimes the future becomes easier to face when cinema takes us back to the beginning, to fire, to steel, to a child watching the world end, and to the terrible question of what kind of person survives after everything gentle has been taken away. Conan the Barbarian is a 1982 sword and sorcery fantasy adventure directed by John Milius, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan, James Earl Jones as Thulsa Doom, Sandal Bergman as Valeria, Jerry Lopez as Sabatai, Marco as the wizard and narrator, and Max von Sydow in a brief but memorable role as King Osric. And on paper that sounds almost simple: a warrior, a villain, a lost childhood, a quest, a world of kingdoms, ruins, cults, thieves, and steel. But the film itself does not feel simple in the way that description sounds. It feels like a legend remembered by someone who survived it, not a story arranged neatly for our comfort. From its first images, the film places us inside a world that seems older than history, but not innocent enough to be a fairy tale. This is not a fantasy realm of shining castles and noble bloodlines. It is a world of smoke-dark villages, brutal markets, ancient towers, strange temples, desert roads, and people who speak as if language itself is just another tool of power. The land feels half born and half decayed, as though civilization has tried to rise here many times and each attempt has left behind only bones, walls, rituals, and rumors. At its heart, this is a revenge story. Conan begins as a child whose life is shattered by violence, and the rest of the film follows the long, strange path of what that violence makes of him. But to describe it only as revenge is to miss the emotional shape underneath. The film is really about formation. It asks what happens when a person is built by forces that never asked his permission. What happens when childhood is replaced by labor, when grief is replaced by strength, when identity is not discovered gently but hammered into the body through suffering. That is why Arnold Schwarzenegger's presence matters so much. He was not yet the fully polished movie star he would become later in the decade. Here he has a rawness that fits the material. His performance is not built from long emotional speeches or subtle verbal shifts. It is built from physical language, the way Conan stands, the way he watches, The way he moves through danger with an almost animal alertness, the way his face can seem distant, as if some part of him is always still trapped in the first wound of his life. These could easily have become a weakness, and sometimes it nearly does. The film asks us to accept Conan less as a psychologically dead modern character and more as a mythic figure. He is not written to reveal himself through confession. Is revealed through action, through appetite, through silence, through the people he chooses to stand beside, and through the enemy he cannot stop moving toward. In another kind of film, that might feel too thin. Here, because the world itself is built like an old tale, it often feels appropriate. Conan is not a man explaining his soul. He is a legend slowly realizing it has a soul. John Milius directs this world with a seriousness that gives the film its identity. He does not treat the material as light adventure, he treats it as ritual. There is a heaviness to the pacing, a patience in the way the camera observes landscapes, bodies, weapons, and ceremonies. The film often seems more interested in atmosphere than momentum. It wants you to feel the temperature of the world before you understand the mechanics of the plot. It lets scenes breathe in ways that can feel hypnotic and sometimes, depending on your patience, slightly distant. That distance is part of the film's strange personality. Conan the Barbarian is not warm in an ordinary sense. It does not pull you close with charm. It pulls you in through texture, through the sound of drums, through the glow of fire and stone, through the sight of warriors moving across empty land, through the feeling that every object has been touched by superstition. This is fantasy as physical reality, not fantasy as digital spectacle. You can feel the leather, the dust, the metal, the sweat, the stone. Even when the word is exaggerated, it has weight. The cast around Conan give the film different kinds of energy. James R. Jones brings Thulsa Doom, a calm, unsettling authority. He does not play him as a loud monster. He plays him as someone who understands the seduction of power. That choice is crucial, because Thulsa Doom is not frightening only because he can destroy. He is frightening because people want to follow him. He represents a kind of spiritual domination, the ability to turn pain, fear, and longing into worship, and that makes him a deeper enemy for Conan than a simple battlefield opponent. He is not only the man connected to Conan's loss, he is the image of power pretending to be meaning. Sandar Bergman's Valeria brings a sharper, more human spark into the film. She is agile, intense, and alive in a way that cuts through some of the film's solemnity. Valeria matters because she gives Conan something beyond revenge to respond to. She becomes a glimpse of companionship in a life shaped by damage. She is not merely a romantic presence. At her best, she is a mirror of freedom, danger, and choice. Through her, the film briefly lets Conan seem less like a weapon and more like a person who might have lived differently in another world. Cherry Lopez's Sabotage adds another texture, a sense of partnership and movement. His friendship with Conan is not deeply explained, but in a film where so much emotion lives beneath the surface, their bond gives the story a necessary feeling of shared survival. Marcus Wizard, meanwhile, brings narration and mystery, giving the film the quality of a tale being passed down from one age to another. His presence helps frame Conan not just as a man who lived, but as a figure who became story. So, should you watch Conan the Barbarian? Yes, but with the right expectation. Do not come to it looking for the speed of modern fantasy, the emotional clarity of contemporary blockbuster writing, or a perfectly balanced adventure. Come to it for atmosphere. Come to it for mythic imagery. Come to it for one of the most important early screen appearances of Schwarzenegger as an action icon. Come to it for Basil Podaris's enormous, mournful, heroic score. Come to it for a fantasy film that feels less engineered and more forged. This is a film for people who can appreciate rough beauty, for people who do not need every emotion explained aloud, for people who understand that sometimes cinema works through shape before psychology, through sound before language, through image before argument. It is not always elegant. It is not always deep in the places it wants to be, but when it works with the force of something ancient being dragged into the light. And to really understand that force, we have to stop treating the film as an object from a distance and sit with what it feels like to enter it for the first time. That first contact with its smell. It's a strange, solemn dream. When I first sat with this film, I expected something louder. That sounds strange because Conan the Barbarian is not exactly a quiet film in subject. It has raids, battles, rituals, executions, creatures, thieves, cults, kings, and warriors. It has a world where danger is almost always close. But emotionally, what struck me first was not noise, it was weight. A film opens with a feeling that we are not being invited into a normal adventure, but lured into an old story whose surface had end over centuries. There is something solemn about it from the beginning, something almost ceremonial, as if the film is asking us to listen before it asks us to be entertained. And that opening feeling matters, because the first minutes of Conan the Barbarian do not move like a modern action film trying to win your attention instantly. They move like a myth remembering its own wound. The images feel simple, even blunt, but they have a kind of primal clarity. A child, a village, a sword, a lesson about steel, a family. Then the violent arrival of history into private life. The film does not over explain the world. It simply shows us that this is a place where life can be erased in a moment, and where the things adults teach children may be the only fragments that survive after everything else is gone. What struck me most was how quickly the film removes ordinary childhood from Conan's life. It does not spend much time showing innocence, but it gives us just enough to understand the scale of what is taken. And then, once that loss happens, the film almost refuses to comfort us. It does not pause to give the child language for grief. It does not surround him with explanation. It sends him into labor, repetition, exhaustion, and time. That choice gives the film one of its most memorable early images, a human life turning around a wheel until the body changes, but the soul remains locked inside the original injury. Think about it this way. Many revenge stories begin with trauma and then rush toward action. Conan the Barbarian lets trauma become duration. It stretches pain across years, not through dialogue but through physical transformation. We watch the boy become a man, and yet the film makes that transformation feel less like empowerment and consequence. His strength is impressive, but it is also tragic. It was purchased by deprivation. His body becomes a monument to everything he survived, but also to everything he never got to be. That was the first thing that made the film feel different from what I came in expecting. I expected a fantasy warrior movie built mainly on spectacle. What I found, at least in its strongest passages, was a film deeply interested in the making of a mythic body. Not a realistic psychology exactly, but a symbolic one. Conan is not written as someone who processes pain, he is written as someone pain has shaped into form. The film asks us to read him almost like sculpture. What does this posture mean? What does this silence mean? What does this sudden violence mean? What does it mean when a person who has been denied tenderness can still recognize loyalty, desire, friendship, and wonder? The atmosphere from minute one is heavy with that question. The world feels dangerous not because the film explains every political structure or kingdom, but because every location seems to contain a possible threat. A road is not just a road, it is exposure. A temple is not just a building, it is power disguised as holiness. A marketplace is not just commerce, it is a reminder that bodies can become property, entertainment, or sacrifice. The film's world is not complex in the modern lore building sense, but it feels spiritually hostile, and that hostility gives Kunan's silence a different meaning. He is not quiet because there is nothing inside him. He is quiet because this world has never rewarded softness. The pacing also surprised me. There are stretches where the film seems almost unconcerned with urgency. It wanders through training, wandering, discovery, theft, desire, and ritual with a rhythm that can feel dreamlike. At first, that can be challenging. You may find yourself waiting for the story to tighten, but then the rhythm begins to make a certain kind of sense. The film is not only moving from plot point to plot point, it is accumulating a sense of life in a brutal world. It wants Conan's journey to feel less like a clean mission and more like a harsh education. And here is the part I keep coming back to. The film feels most alive when it lets music and image speak before character. Basil Polidorus' score does extraordinary emotional work. It gives shape to what Conan cannot say. It gives the world grandeur without making it noble. It gives violence an almost tragic scale. It lets the story feel ancient even when the actual writing is simple. During those early passages, the music seems to carry memory itself, as though the film is being sung by history rather than narrated by a person. That is why the first encounter with Conan the Barbarian can be slightly disorienting. It is not as fast as you might expect, it is not as playful as its poster might suggest. It is not always emotionally accessible in the usual way, but it has a mood that settles over you. It asks you to accept a different mode of watching, one where character is expressed through movement, where morality is often harsh and instinctive, where the world is understood through texture rather than explanation. And once I adjusted to that mode, I began to see the film's strange confidence. It believes in its own myths. That is rare. Many fantasy films are embarrassed by their own grandeur, so they undercut it with jokes or over explanation. This one does not. It stares directly into its own firelight. Sometimes that seriousness becomes stiff, sometimes it becomes powerful, but either way, it gives the film an identity. So the first time sitting with it felt like entering a dream that had been carved instead of written. Rough edges everywhere, moments that do not fully connect, performances that sometimes feel more iconic than intimate, but also images with undeniable force. A child at the age of loss, a wheel turning through years, a warrior emerging from suffering with no language except survival, a world where gods are invoked, but steel seems to answer more reliably. And from that first feeling, the film begins to open into its true shape, not as a simple journey from weakness to strength, but as an emotional passage through captivity, violence, companionship, temptation, love, belief, and revenge. The story is not just what happens to Conan, it is what the world teaches him, what it takes from him, what it gives him by accident, and what he must finally decide to become when the past stands before him wearing the face of a god. The story of Conan the Barbarian begins with an act of destruction, but the experience of the story begins with an inheritance. Before Conan becomes a warrior, before he becomes a thief, before he becomes the figure people remember from posters and fantasy art, he is a child receiving a belief. His father teaches him that steel has a sacred importance, that weapons are not simply tools but extensions of survival and identity. In another kind of film, this lesson might feel like simple foreshadowing. Here, it feels like a worldview being placed into a child's hands before the child is old enough to know what a worldview costs. That matters because the film immediately tests the value of that belief. Conan's village is destroyed by raiders led by Thulsa Doom, and the film presents this not as a conventional action sequence but as the violent collapse of an entire universe. A child watches the structures that made life understandable disappear. Family, home, safety, continuity, even the ordinary shape of tomorrow. All of it is taken. The event is not treated with psychological explanation. The film is too mythic for that. But emotionally, it gives Conan his central wound. Everything after this is not simply revenge. It is the long afterlife of that first rupture, and what makes the early section so haunting is the way the film turns time into punishment. Conan is not rescued, he is not guided, he is not given a mentor who helps him transform pain into wisdom. He is forced into labor, chained to repetition, and made to push the wheel of pain until years pass and the boy's body becomes something almost unrecognizable. This is one of the film's defining images because it says so much without needing explanation. The wheel is captivity, but it is also training. It is suffering, but it is also creation. It is an instrument of oppression that accidentally forges the very person who will one day resist the world that used it against him. That is the brutal irony at the heart of Conan's formation. The forces that try to reduce him into a body also make his body powerful. The world tries to erase his identity, but it cannot erase memory. It can harden him, sell him, display him, train him, use him, but somewhere inside the silence remains a child who remembers fire, a face, an emblem, a blade, and the feeling of everything being stolen. When Conan is eventually removed from the wheel and thrown into the fighting pits, the story shifts from endurance to survival as performance. He is no longer just laboring in obscurity, he becomes spectacle. Other people watch him fight. Other people profit from his body. Other people turn his survival into entertainment. And this is where the film quietly deepens its understanding of power. Conan is not free simply because he becomes strong. Strength can exist inside captivity. Skill can be cultivated by systems that still own you. The film does not say this in modern language, but the shape of the story understands it. His training expands. He is taught weapons, combat, discipline, and given exposed to knowledge beyond brute force. There is something almost strange about this passage because the film condenses years of formation into a mythic montage of physical and cultural shaping. Conan becomes less like an individual moving through realistic development and more like a figure being assembled by civilization's harshest institutions. Slavery, combat, travel, language, pleasure, violence, philosophy, and survival all leave marks on him. He is educated by a word without tenderness. Then suddenly, freedom arrives almost absurdly. Conan is released into the wilderness, as if the word that shaped him has grown bored of possessing him, and the film makes this freedom feel less triumphant than uncertain. What does freedom mean to someone who has never been allowed to practice it? What does a man do when his body is powerful but his inner life has been reduced to instinct and memory? Conan does not step into freedom with a clear plan. He wanders into it. He stumbles into danger. He discovers the remains of older civilizations, finds a sword in a tomb, and begins to take on the visual shape of the warrior he has been moving toward all along. The sword matters, of course. In this film, weapons carry almost spiritual weight. Conan finding a blade is not only a practical development, it is a symbolic reunion with the belief planted in him as a child. Steel becomes memory. Steel becomes identity. Steel becomes the one inheritance the world could not fully take away, even when it destroyed the person who first taught him its value. But the film is also careful, in its own blunt way, to complicate that belief. Steel may be powerful, but it does not explain everything. It does not heal grief. It does not replace love. It does not protect the innocent by itself. It is only as meaningful as the will that holds it. As Conan moves through the world, the film begins to open from solitary survival into companionship. His meeting with Subotai gives the story a lighter movement without making it soft. Subotai is a thief, a wanderer, a man of appetite and skill, someone who seems to understand freedom more naturally than Conan does. Their friendship is not built through long emotional confession. It forms through shared danger, humor, practicality, and the unspoken recognition between people who know that the world is not gentle. In the field this severe, even a simple partnership feels meaningful. What is interesting about Conan and Sabotai is that they do not become friends because the script insists on sentiment. They become friends because survival is less lonely when someone else knows how to survive beside you. Subotai adds motion to Conan's stillness. He brings a sense of worldly ease, a belief in gods and fate that feels different from Conan's heavier relationship with steel and memory. Their bond gives the film one of its first hints that Conan's life might become more than the wound that created him. Then Valeria enters, and the film changes temperature. Valeria is crucial because she is not only someone Conan desires, she is someone who matches him in danger. She moves through the world with confidence, agility, and a kind of fierce independence. She is not innocent, not decorative in the simple sense, not outside the violence of this world. She knows how to steal, fight, choose, and escape. And because of that, her presence gives Conan something rare, not comfort exactly, but recognition. She sees the warrior in him, but she also brings out the possibility that he might be more than a weapon. The sequence involving the tower and the serpent cult is where the film begins to combine adventure, horror, religion, and desire into one strange shape. Conan, Subotai, and Valeria enter a space that feels both sacred and corrupt, a place where worship and danger are intertwined. The cult imagery matters because Thulsa Doom's power is not merely military, it is spiritual. His followers do not simply fear him, they believe in him. And belief in this film may be more frightening than force. Force can dominate the body, belief can invite the soul to participate in its own surrender. This is one of the film's strongest ideas. Thulsa Doom is dangerous because he understands that people are hungry for meaning. He offers them transformation, belonging, surrender, and the illusion that giving themselves away will free them from pain. That makes him a dark mirror to Conan. Conan was shaped by pain into independence, however damaged. Thulsa Doom shapes pain into dependence. He takes people who are searching for something and turns their longing into obedience. When Conan and his companions steal from the cult, the film gives us adventure on the surface, but beneath it there is a deeper collision. Conan is unknowingly moving closer to the source of his childhood wound, but he does so through theft, instinct, and appetite rather than moral clarity. That is important. Conan is not a noble knight on a righteous quest in the traditional sense. He is a survivor driven by memory, desire, anger, and opportunity. The film allows him to be rough because its world is rough. His heroism, if we can call it that, is not polished. It emerges gradually from loyalty and confrontation rather than purity. After the theft, the story briefly allows pleasure to enter. Conan, Valeria, and Sabotai enjoy the rewards of their daring. There is laughter, sensuality, excess, and the feeling of people who have lived close to danger, allowing themselves to taste life. This section matters more than it might seem because it shows what Conan could want if revenge did not own him. Valeria especially represents the possibility of a different future. Not a peaceful domestic future exactly, that would not fit either of them, but a life of movement, partnership, danger chosen rather than imposed, freedom shared rather than endured alone. And this is where the film becomes emotionally more interesting than its simple outline suggests. Conan's connection with Valeria is not tender in a delicate way, but it carries the weight of discovery. He is a man who has known bodies through violence, labor, combat, and survival. Through Valeria, he begins to know closeness as something chosen. She does not make him soft, she makes softness imaginable, even if only for a moment. She gives him a glimpse of life beyond the veil, beyond the pit, beyond the first wound. But the past does not release him. King Osric's request pulls the story toward Thulsa Doom again. Osric wants his daughter rescued from Doom's influence, but what he is really asking is for someone to enter the heart of a belief system that has swallowed his family. His grief is different from Conan's, but it echoes it. Both men have lost something to Thulsa Doom. Both have been made powerless in front of a force that does not only take lives, but takes devotion, identity, and love. Osric's wealth and status cannot protect him from the humiliation of spiritual loss. His daughter is alive, but her inner allegiance has been captured. That idea gives the quest a more unsettling dimension. This is not simply about entering an enemy stronghold, it is about entering a world where people want their chains. Forza Doom's followers do not all behave like prisoners, many behave like believers, and that makes Conan's mission more complicated because physical strength alone cannot easily defeat an idea. You can break a guard, you can steal a jewel, you can defeat a creature. But how do you fight the part of a person that has chosen surrender because surrender feels like meaning? Valeria senses the danger of this path. She understands, perhaps more clearly than Conan, that revenge is not the same as freedom. She offers him the possibility of living, of choosing life over the past. And this is one of the emotional pivots of the film. Conan has companionship, he has wealth, he has love or something close to it. He has a path away from the wound, but he cannot take it because the wound has not finished speaking. The symbol he remembers from childhood is no longer just memory, it has become a summons. This is where Conan's character becomes both powerful and tragic. He is strong enough to survive almost anything, but not yet free enough to stop moving toward the source of his pain. He has escaped the wheel, but inwardly he is still turning. Revenge gives him direction, but direction is not the same as healing. The film understands this through action rather than speech. Conan does not need to explain why he goes. We know the child inside him is still standing in the ashes of the village. So he enters Dulsadum's world more directly, and the film's atmosphere becomes stranger, darker, more hypnotic. The cult is not presented as a simple villain organization. It feels like a corruption of spiritual longing. There are rituals, symbols, followers, hierarchies, and a seductive promise of release from ordinary identity. Doom's power lies partly in calmness. He does not need to reach constantly because he believes he already possesses the deeper force, the ability to make others obey willingly. And when Conan finally comes close to him, the encounter is not only physical, it is philosophical in the film's blunt mythic language. Conan believes in steel because steel is what remains from his father, his childhood, his survival. Doom challenges that belief by demonstrating that flesh, fear, desire, and devotion can be stronger than any blade. This is the central conflict beneath the revenge plot. What is power? Is it the weapon? Is it the body? Is it belief? Is it the ability to command another person's will? Is it memory? Is it love? Is it the refusal to kneel inside your own soul? The film does not answer all of this cleanly, but it makes the questions feel present. Conan's confrontation with Doom's word leads him into suffering again, but now the suffering is different. As a child, he was powerless. As a man, he has strength, skill, and will, yet he still discovers that strength alone cannot protect him from everything. That is an important part of the story's emotional journey. The film spent so much time making Conan physically impressive that when he is broken down, the moment carries symbolic weight. It reminds us that a mythic body is still mortal, a legend can still bleed, a survivor can still be brought back to the edge of helplessness, and what saves him is not steel alone. This is where the relationships around Conan become essential. Subotai, Valeria, and the wizard each matter because they reveal that Conan's life has expanded beyond revenge without him fully realizing it. The man who began as an isolated wound has become someone others will risk themselves for. That may sound simple, but for this film it is almost profound. In a world obsessed with domination, loyalty becomes a form of resistance. In a story built around violence, care becomes the surprising force that allows the hero to continue. The film's middle movement, then, is not just a chain of adventures, it is a harsh emotional education. Conan learns the world through captivity, then combat, then wandering, then friendship, then love, then temptation, then belief, then defeat. Each stage adds something to him. Each stage complicates the revenge that seemed so simple at the beginning. By the time he moves toward the final confrontation, he is no longer only the child of the opening tragedy. He is also the man shaped by those who chose to stand beside him. And here is where the film shifts completely. The making of Conan the Barbarian feels almost perfectly matched to the film itself, because this was not a clean little production that slipped easily into existence. It was a project with a long prehistory, shifting creative hands, logistical complications, physical risk, and a final shape that seems to carry all that struggle in its bones. The film looks like something forged, and in a way, its production story was also a kind of forging. According to the AFI catalogue, Conan the Barbarian had been in different stages of development since 1977, with Edward Pressman involved in bringing the project toward Universal and Arnold Schwarzenegger already set to star before the film reached its final creative form. That detail reshapes how you see the movie, because Conan does not feel like a role Arnold happened to take. It feels like a role the industry had been slowly preparing around him, waiting for his physical presence to meet the right mythic frame. And that is the first fascinating thing about the film's origin. It was not born instantly out of one simple studio decision. It moved through development, rights negotiations, and creative reshaping before John Milius became the defining voice of the finished work. Oliver Stone was hired to write a script based on Robert E. Howard's stories, and later, when Dino De Laurentiis joined the project, Milius returned and reworked the material. That history matters because the final film feels like a collision between pulp fantasy, heavy myth, and masculine ritual, not merely an adaptation, but a reinterpretation of an already powerful literary figure to a very specific cinematic temperament. You can feel Milios's hand in the seriousness of it. A lighter director might have leaned into calm. A more purely commercial director might have made the film faster and cleaner. Milios treats Conan like an old legend being spoken over fire. He allows the story to move with ceremony. He makes the world feel not just adventurous but ideological. Every sword, cart, body, and landscape seems to belong to a philosophy of strength, survival, and fate. Whether that philosophy is always fully examined is another question, but the commitment is unmistakable. The second fascinating fact is that the film was initially expected to shoot across places including Yugoslavia, Spain, and England, but political turmoil after the death of Yugoslavia's president, along with production problems, reportedly delayed the start. AFI notes that shooting eventually began in January 1981 exclusively in Spain. That changes the way you look at the filmed landscapes. Spain does not simply serve as a backdrop, it becomes the physical grammar of the Hyborian Age. The deserts, rocks, ruins, and open spaces give the film a dry, ancient, sunburned reality. This is why the world feels tangible. The film does not have the weightless quality of fantasy built only from imagination. It has real heat in it, real dust, real stone, real empty horizons. The locations have the story feel less like a painted dream and more like a place where bodies would actually suffer. Conan's journey needs that kind of landscape because his body is always in conversation with the world around him. He climbs, drags, fights, walks, falls, and rises against environments that look indifferent to him. The earth itself seems to be another test. The production design, credited to Ron Cobb, is also essential to that feeling. Cobb's work helps the film avoid the polished cleanliness that can weaken fantasy. The spaces in Conan feel lived in but not cozy, they feel symbolic but not delicate. A throne room, a cult chamber, a wheel, a tomb, a marketplace, each space feels designed around power, not comfort. Power. And that is exactly right for this story because Conan's world is one where architecture often expresses domination. People build upward, inward, and underground as if they are trying to make belief permanent in stone. The third fascinating fact is the physical danger surrounding the sword work. According to IFI's production notes, Sandal Bergman nearly lost a finger in a sword fight accident with a stunt person. That is not trivia for shock. It changes how we read Valeria's presence. Her agility and intensity are not decorative qualities placed on top of the film. They came from a production where bodies were genuinely being asked to inhabit risk. When Valeria moves through combat, there is a sharpness to her that feels earned by the physical demands around the role. That physicality is one of the reasons the film still has impact. Modern fantasy action often protects us from the labor of bodies. Cuts are faster, effects are smoother, and danger can feel abstract. Conan the Barbarian often feels heavy because the people in the frame seem connected to the weapons they carry. The fights are not always elegant by modern standards, but they have weight. You feel the swing, the reach, the imbalance, the impact, and because the actors are photographed like figures in a mythic painting, the physical labor becomes part of the film's visual language. Casting was the other great act of construction. Schwarzenegger gives the film its monument, James Earl Jones gives it its voice of terrifying calm. Sandal Bergman gives it speed, danger, and emotional fire. Margot gives it the feeling of our legend. Max von Sydow, even in limited time, brings aged authority, as if the film briefly opens a door into another kingdom's grief. The cast does not always operate in the same emotional register, but that unevenness strangely fits the word. Everyone feels like they come from a different fragment of myth. The fourth fascinating fact is that the film's release was reportedly delayed from Christmas 1981 to spring 1982 after a screening for Universal executives, with speculation at the time that violence may have been a concern, though a Universal official denied that connection and said the film needed more work. This detail matters because it reminds us how difficult the film's tone was to place. It was not plain family fantasy, it was not prestige drama, it was not simple action. It was a violent, solemn, muscular myth arriving in a marketplace that may not have known exactly what to do with it, and that difficulty is still visible. Conan sometimes feels as if it is fighting against ordinary entertainment expectations. It wants to be mythic when the audience might expect momentum. It wants to be brutal when the fantasy genre often invites wonder. It wants to be silent when a studio might want explanation. That tension can make the film feel uneven, but it also gives it identity. A smoother version might have been more immediately accessible but less memorable. The fifth fascinating fact is how much emotional responsibility falls on Basil Polidorus' score. AFI credits Polidorus as composer. And it is hard to imagine the film without him because the music does not merely decorate the images, it completes them. It gives Conan's silence a voice. It gives the landscape scale. It gives the revenge story a tragic lift. Without that score, the film might feel too blunt. With it, the bluntness becomes ceremonial. This is what production really means here. Not just who wrote, who directed, where it filmed, or how difficult the shoot became, but how every creative choice pushed the film toward the same sensation, a world where myth has physical cost. The development history gives it density, Spain gives it earth, Ron Cobb's design gives it structure, the cast gives it iconography, the stunt work gives it danger, Paul Doris gives it anger, Paul Doris gives it a soul. And once you understand how the film was made, the movie's achievements become easier to separate from its reputation. This is not merely a sword movie that became famous because Arnold looked right holding a blade. It is a film where sound, design, body, landscape, and myth all work together to create a specific cinematic spell, imperfect, severe, unforgettable when it rises. What Conan the Barbarian achieves most powerfully is atmosphere with weight. That may sound simple, but it is not. Many fantasy films create worlds. Fewer make those worlds feel like they existed before the camera arrived and will continue after the story ends. Conan does not explain the Hyborian Age with the obsessive detail of modern lore building. It does something more instinctive. It gives us fragments, a village, a wheel, a pit, a tomb, a tower, a cult, a palace, a battlefield, a funeral pyre. Each place feels like a piece broken from a larger civilization we are never allowed to fully map. And because the film refuses to over explain, the world becomes more mysterious. That mystery is one of its great strengths. The film understands that myth does not become powerful because we know everything. Myth becomes powerful because we feel that something ancient is moving underneath what we can see. When Conan walks through ruins, the film does not need to tell us the complete history of those stones. The silence around them does the work. When a cult gathers in ritual, the film does not need to give us a full theology. The atmosphere tells us enough. People are frightened, hungry, lonely, and ready to surrender themselves to someone who promises meaning. Arnold Schwarzenegger's performance is central to this achievement because the film builds Conan around presence rather than explanation. He is not asked to carry the role like a conventional traumatic lead, he carries it like an image that slowly gathers emotion. His body becomes the film's first language. The shoulders, the stance, the stillness, the way he seems to absorb the world before reacting to it, all of that tells us who Conan is before words could. And while the performance has limitations, those limitations often work inside the mythic frame. Conan does not feel like a modern man trapped in fantasy clothing. He feels like someone formed by a war where inner life has to hide behind survival. The scene that proves this most completely is not only a battle scene. It is a long visual arc from the child at the wheel to the grown man shaped by years of forced labor. That transformation is performance through image. The film asks us to understand a life through repetition and physical change. It shows us that Conan's strength is not heroic in a clean way, it is the residue of suffering. That is why his body carries sadness even when the film celebrates its power. The muscle is impressive, but the story behind it is cruel. The achievement is that the film lets both things be true. James Earl Jones achieves something very different as Thulsa Doom. His villainy is not built on constant aggression, it is built on calm authority. He speaks and moves like someone who has learned that the deepest form of power is not always force but influence. He understands the human desire to be led. He understands how grief can become devotion. He understands that people who feel lost may give themselves to anyone who offers certainty. That makes him more unsettling than a simple warlord. He is a spiritual predator, and Jones gives him the patience of someone who believes he has already won before the sword is drawn. What makes Doom so effective is that he represents a challenge to Conan's inherited belief. Conan's childhood is marked by the sacred idea of steel, by the belief that strength lives in the weapon, in the hand, in what can be forged and held. Doom presents another kind of strength, the command of the mind, the domination of belief, the power to make someone act against their own life because they have given you authority over meaning. The film may be blunt, but this contrast gives it real thematic force. Steel against flesh, body against will, revenge against belief. Sandar Burman's Valeria is another major achievement because she brings movement and danger into a film that can otherwise become very heavy. Her performance has a dancer's physical intelligence. She does not just fight, she moves with purpose. She gives Valeria a sense of independence that makes her relationship with Conan matter. She is not there simply to soften him, she expands him. She reveals that Conan can respond to loyalty, desire, humor, and grief. Through her, the film briefly imagines a future that is not ruled entirely by the past. The writing works best when it understands archetype. This is not a screenplay of dense conversation or layered social detail. It is a screenplay of symbolic movement. A child loses everything. A body is forged. A sword is found. Companions appear. A false prophet rises. Love interrupts revenge. Death deepens purpose. The final confrontation becomes not only personal but almost spiritual. When the script stays within that mythic simplicity, it has power. It knows how to give the story the shape of an ordeal, where the writing becomes more than functional, is in its recurring ideas. Still, flesh, worship, memory, transformation, power. These ideas return in different forms, and each return changes the way we understand Conan's journey. The father's lesson about steel seemed simple at first. Later, Doom complicates it by suggesting that human will can be stronger than any weapon. Then the ending forces Conan to answer the question not through debate but through action. This is what the film does well. It turns philosophy into images. The visual language is equally important. John Milius framed the world with a painterly seriousness. Bodies often appear against landscapes as if they are part of a mural. Firelight matters, shadows matter. The camera frequently gives space around characters, making them feel small against deserts, temples, and ruins. This is not just visual beauty. It tells us that Conan is moving through forces larger than himself. History, violence, religion, death, and fate seem to surround him long before he can understand them. The director also understands stillness. Some of the film's strongest moments are not its loudest. A figure standing before a fire, a warrior watching from a distance, a temple space filled with dangerous quiet, a body held in the frame long enough for us to feel the cost of survival. These choices give the movie its ancient rhythm. Modern fantasy often fears silence because silence can make the audience restless. Conan trusts it, sometimes too much perhaps, but often beautifully. The score may be the film's greatest achievement. Basil Polidoris gives Conan the Barbarian an emotion and scale the screenplay alone could not provide. The music is not just heroic. It is mournful, ceremonial, romantic, and immense. It seems to understand that Conan's story is not only about action but about destiny formed through loss. The score tells us when the film is grieving, when it is worshipping, when it is dreaming, when it is dreaming, when it is rising toward mist. It gives the word a soul that the dialogue often leaves unspoken. And the way the music enters and exits matters. It often arrives like memory. It does not merely underline the action, it transforms the action into legend. A journey across land becomes more than travel. A battle becomes more than violence. A funeral becomes more than farewell. The score enlarges everything, but it rarely feels random. It carries the emotional intelligence of the film. If Conan cannot fully speak his inner life, the music speaks around him. Sound and silence work together in a similar way. The clash of weapons feels harsh because the quiet around it is so present. The chanting of the cult feels unsettling because the world outside it often feels empty. The voice of narration gives the story the texture of remembrance, as though this is not happening now, but being summoned from a distant age. The film's soundscape is not always subtle, but it is deeply committed to mood. Another achievement is the film's refusal to make fantasy clean. This world has dirt under its nails. Its costumes, spaces, and rituals feel physical. The film knows that fantasy becomes more convincing when beauty and ugliness coexist. A palace can be majestic and rotten. A warrior can be powerful and damaged. A love story can be passionate and doomed. A victory can feel necessary and lonely. The movie's best moments live in those contradictions. And perhaps the most important achievement is that Conan the Barbarian creates iconography that still feels distinct. The Wheel of Pain, the Atlantean sword, Thulsa Doom's hypnotic cult, Valeria's fiery presence, the funeral image, Conan seated in thought and exhaustion, not yet king, not yet legend, but already marked by both. These images remain because they are simple enough to remember and strange enough to echo. Cinema rarely does this when it is embarrassed by its own myth. This film is never embarrassed. It may be uneven, it may be limited, it may sometimes confuse heaviness with depth, but it believes completely in the world it is making. That belief becomes contagious. Even when the story thins, the atmosphere holds. Even when the dialogue feels bare, the score rises. Even when character psychology remains distant, the images continue speaking. That is what Conan the Barbarian achieves. It turns pulp into ritual. It turns a revenge story into a myth of formation. It turns a bodybuilder into a cinematic archetype. It turns landscapes into emotional states. It turns music into memory. And in its strongest passages, it makes you feel as if you are not watching a fantasy film from 1982, but listening to an old story being told by firelight, where every pause matters because the silence may be older than the words. What Conan the Barbarian communicates most clearly, it often communicates before anyone speaks. That is one of the strange beauties of the film. It belongs to a genre where you might expect declarations, prophecies, battle cries, and heavy explanations of destiny. And yes, the film has narration, ritual speech, and mythic statements, but its deepest emotional language is visual. It is the pause before movement, the body held still, the face that does not know how to ask for mercy, the landscape that seems to answer human suffering with complete indifference. Conan himself is built from silence, not because he is empty, but because his life has drained language out of him. As a child, he sees too much too early. Then he is pushed through years of labor and violence where words would not save him. By the time he becomes a man, speech feels almost secondary to existence. His silence is not mystery for style alone. It is evidence. It tells us that some wounds do not become stories immediately. Some wounds become posture. Some become instinct. Some become the way a person looks at the world, as if the world is always about to strike first. This is where the film's restraint does its strongest work. When the camera holds on Conan, it often asks us to read the distance between his body and his inner life. He is physically present, almost monumental, but emotionally concealed. That concealment becomes tragic because we understand why it exists. He has survived by becoming difficult to reach. His stillness is armor, his silence is another kind of steel. The Wheel of Pain is maybe the purest example of the film's visual intelligence. The image does not need explanation. A child walks in a circle, years pass, the circle continues, the body changes. The world does not. There is no speech that could make that idea stronger. The wheel tells us that oppression is repetition. It tells us that time can be used as a weapon. It tells us that survival can create strength without creating freedom. And because the film lets that image breathe, it becomes more powerful than a paragraph of exposition could ever be. Think about what that means. The film's most famous early transformation is not shown through training dialogue or emotional confession. It is shown through a body trapped in motion. The silence around that motion makes the image almost sacred and horrifying at the same time. We are not watching a heroic origin in the usual sense. We are watching a person being ground into shape by a machine of suffering. The film trusts us to feel the cruelty without naming it too loudly. This same language appears in the landscapes. Empty space in Conan is never neutral. Deserts, mountains, ruins, and open roads make the characters feel exposed to forces older than themselves. The film often places Conan against vast environments, and the effect is not just visual scale, it is emotional scale. His grief is enormous to him, but the world around him is even larger, older, and colder. The silence of the land tells us that nature will not explain his pain back to him. It will simply let him pass through, if he is strong enough. The tomb sequence carries this beautifully. Conan enters a dead place and finds an old king, an old sword, and the remains of a forgotten age. There is very little need for explanation because the image itself contains the meaning. A dead ruler still seated indicates authority, a weapon waiting in the dust, a living survivor taking inheritance from the dead. It feels like history handing violence to the next generation. The silence in that scene is not empty. It is full of everything that has ended before Conan arrived. Valeria's presence also changes the film's silence. With her, the quiet is not only harsh, it becomes charged with possibility. The glances between Conan and Valeria often carry more than the words around them. They are both people who understand danger physically. They do not need to over explain attraction, trust, or risk. Their connection has the quality of two flames recognizing the same wind. In a softer film, love might be spoken into shape. Here, it is shown through proximity, through shared movement, through the rare moments when Conan's guardedness seems to loosen. And that is why the film's omissions matter. It does not show us every private conversation Conan and Valeria might have. It does not give us a modern emotional unpacking of what they mean to each other. That absence can make the relationship feel thin for some viewers, and that criticism is fair. But at its best, the omission gives their bond a mythic simplicity. They are not written as ordinary lovers with ordinary language. They are two dangerous souls meeting inside a world that rarely allows tenderness to survive. The film lets that be felt rather than fully explained. Thulsa Doom's silence works differently. His quiet is controlled. He does not need to shout because his power is already internalized by others. When the camera observes his followers, their stillness feels surrendered. They are not silent like Conan, who has been wounded into reserve. They are silent like people who have given their will away. That contrast is one of the film's sharper ideas. Silence can be survival, or it can be submission. It can protect the self or erase it. The court spaces understand this. People gather, wait, listen, kneel, stir. The atmosphere feels heavy because the silence is collective. It is the silence of belief becoming obedience. Doom's power fills the room even when he is not moving much. And the film allows that stillness to become frightening because it suggests that violence is not always loud. Sometimes domination looks calm. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it convinces people that surrender is peace. The final sections of the film also depend on what is not shown or not said. Grief, especially, is treated through ritual image more than explanation. The funeral imagery carries enormous emotional force because the film lets fire do what dialogue cannot. Fire becomes farewell, memory, transformation, and promise. Conan does not need a long speech for us to understand that something inside him has changed. The image carries the meaning. The silence around it gives the moment dignity. This is pure cinema. Not perfect cinema, not subtle in every way, but cinema that understands when words would reduce the feeling. Conan the Barbarian is often at its best when it stops trying to explain its world and simply lets us stand inside it. A sword in dust, a body against sky, a temple waiting in darkness, a face turned toward loss, a wheel turning, a flame rising. What this film understands is that silence is not the absence of storytelling. Silence can be the oldest form of storytelling. Before language, there was gesture. Before confession, there was the body. Before history was written, it was carved into stone, sung over fire, and remembered through images. And in its strongest moments, Conan the Barbarian reaches back toward that older language, where cinema becomes less like speech and more like a cave painting lit by flame. For all its power, Conan the Barbarian is not a film without wounds of its own, and the fairest way to talk about its flaws is not to dismiss the film for being old or strange or built in a mode that modern fantasy has largely moved away from. That would be too easy. The more honest question is this: where does the film's mythic simplicity become strength and where does it become limitation? Because so much of Conan depends on archetype, silence, image, and atmosphere. When that works, the film feels ancient. When it does not, it can feel emotionally underwritten. The first place the film sometimes falls short is character depth. Conan works as a mixed figure, but not always as a fully explored person. Film gives us his wound, his body, his direction, and his silence. That is enough to make him iconic. But there are moments where you may want to feel more of the person beneath the legend. Not through long speeches necessarily, that would break the spell, but through smaller human details, a hesitation, a private reaction, a moment where the film lets his inner life surface with more complexity than rage, desire, or endurance. This is the risk of building a protagonist as an archetype. Archetypes are powerful because they are simple enough to carry universal meaning. But they can also become distant. Conan's silence often feels meaningful, but not always. Sometimes it carries grief, sometimes it carries mystery, and sometimes it feels like the film has not found another way to express him. That difference matters. Silence is only cinematic when the image around it is doing emotional work. When the surrounding scene is not strong enough, the silence can become flat. The pacing is another real issue. There is a difference between mythic patience and dramatic looseness, and Conan the Barbarian sometimes moves across that line. The film's slow rhythm keeps it grandeur, but it can also make certain stretches feel heavier than they need to be. The wandering structure is part of the appeal because Conan's journey should feel like a harsh education to a brutal world. Still, not every passage carries equal emotional force. Some scenes feel hypnotic, others feel like connective tissue stretched a little too long, and this is where the film's atmosphere becomes both gift and trap. The mood is so strong that it can almost cover narrative thinness. The score rises, the landscapes expand, the images hold, and for a while the spell continues. But atmosphere cannot solve everything. A film can feel magnificent and still need sharper dramatic progression. Conan sometimes trusts the weight of its world so completely that it forgets to deepen the emotional stakes scene by scene. Valeria is another area where the film both succeeds and falls short. She is memorable, physically expressive, and full of presence. Sandal Bergman gives her real spark, but the writing does not always give her the interior life she deserves. She matters deeply to Conan's journey, yet the film sometimes treats her more as a mythic force in his development than as a fully independent emotional center. We feel her power, we feel her importance, but we do not always get enough of her perspective. That is not a small flaw, because Valeria is one of the few characters who can pull Conan towards something beyond revenge. She represents possibility, freedom, partnership, a life chosen rather than merely survived. If the film had spent more time exploring her inner world, her role in the emotional architecture would have become even stronger. As it stands, she is unforgettable in image and movement, but slightly limited in writing. The same can be said for parts of the world building. The film's refusal to over explain is one of its strengths, but occasionally the world feels less mysterious than unfinished. There is a fine line between leaving space for it and leaving gaps that weaken investment. The Hyborian age feels tactile and atmospheric, but not always socially alive. We understand its brutality, its rituals, its danger, and its surfaces, but we do not always understand enough about how people live inside it, beyond violence, worship, trade, and conquest. Now, to be fair, this may be part of the design. The film is not trying to create a complete civilization in the modern fantasy sense. It is trying to create a legendary world remembered in fragments. But even fragments need variety. At times, the world becomes so defined by harshness that it loses some emotional texture. If everything is brutal, brutality risks becoming ordinary. The film is at its best when it contrasts that harshness with loyalty, humor, sensuality, grief, or wonder. It could have used more of those contrasts. The treatment of certain fantasy images also carries the limitations of its era. Some choices feel less reflective now than they may have seemed then. The film is fascinated by bodies, domination, exoticized spaces, and ritual spectacle, but it does not always question the imagery it uses. There are moments where the film's intensity feels purposeful, and others where it feels too comfortable with pulp fantasy shortcuts. That does not erase its achievements, but it does make the viewing experience more complicated. Thulsa Doom, however, mostly works, and that actually reveals another weakness. He is so compelling as an idea that a film could have gone even further with him. The conflict between steel and flesh, weapon and will, survival and belief is one of the richest parts of the movie. But the film sometimes gestures toward that philosophy more than it fully develops it. Doom's cult is unsettling, but we could understand more about why people surrender to him, not through exposition, but through sharper emotional glimpses of his followers' need. The concept is strong enough that you want the film to push it deeper. The action too has a strange unevenness. Some moments feel heavy and iconic, while others lack the fluidity or tension modern viewers may expect. The fights have physical weight, but not always dramatic clarity. They are memorable more as images than as choreography. Depending on what you value, that may be enough. But when the film wants impact through combat, it sometimes relies more on brutality and music than on carefully escalating suspense, and yet none of these flaws make the film disposable. That is important. These are not failures that empty the movie of meaning, they are limitations that sit beside its strengths. Conan the Barbarian falls short when myth becomes stiffness, when silence becomes thinness, when atmosphere covers for underlying emotion, and when its pulp instincts go unquestioned. But it still has a rare identity, it still has images that remain, it still has music that gives the whole journey tragic power. The flaw is not that the film is simple. Simplicity can be beautiful. The flaw is that the film does not always know when simplicity has done enough, and when the human heart needs one more layer. What Conan the Barbarian is really saying lives beneath the surface of revenge. On the outside, the story is simple enough to understand almost instantly. A child loses everything. That child becomes a warrior. The warrior searches for the figure connected to his loss. The journey moves toward confrontation, but the deeper emotional current is not only about punishment. It is about the question of what remains of a person after the world takes away the first version of their life. That is the film's true wound. Conan is not merely trying to defeat Thulsa Doom because Doom is evil. He is trying to stand in front of the force that interrupted his becoming. He is trying to face the moments that split his life in two. Before Doom, Conan was a child inside a family, a village, a tradition, a set of beliefs. After Doom, he becomes a body moved through systems of ownership, labor, violence, and spectacle. So when he pursues Doom, he is not only chasing a man, he is chasing the origin of his own broken shape. This is why revenge in the film feels both powerful and incomplete. Revenge gives Conan a direction, but it does not give him a self. It gives emotion, but not peace. And that is one of the most honest things the film understands, even if it communicates it through myth rather than psychology. When pain becomes center of a life, purpose can grow from it, but so can imprisonment. Conan escapes the will physically, yet part of him continues turning around the same memory. His journey is not only across lands, it is around the circle of the original wound. The recurring symbol of steel carries that idea beautifully. Steel begins as inheritance. It is what Conan receives from his father as a belief, almost a sacred truth. In his childhood, steel means strength, protection, craft, legacy. It is the thing shaped by fire and hand, the thing that survives. But after his world collapses, steel becomes more complicated. It becomes the language Conan gets in trust when human life has failed him. People can betray, enslave, worship falsely, and disappear. Steel remains hard, visible, responsive. It does what the hand commands. But the film keeps asking whether that is enough. Thulsa Doom exists to challenge the religion of steel. He understands something Conan does not fully understand at first. The deepest power is not always in the weapon, it is in belief. It is in the ability to make people surrender their own will. Doom's cult is frightening because it shows power moving invisibly. A sword can threaten the body, but an idea can enter the mind and make the body obey without resistance. That is a much darker form of domination. So the film becomes a conflict between visible and invisible power. Conan believes in what can be forged, carried, swung, and broken. Doom believes in what can be whispered, promised, staged, and worshipped. Conan is the body shaped by pain. Doom is the voice that teaches others to reinterpret their pain as devotion. And in that contrast, the film says something surprisingly sharp about human vulnerability. People do not follow false gods only because they are foolish. They follow because they are hungry. Hungry for meaning, hungry for certainty, hungry for someone to turn fear into order. That is what this film understands about cultic power. It is not only domination from above, it is surrender from within. Doom gives people a story to live inside, and for those who feel lost, a dangerous story can feel better than no story at all. This is why his followers are unsettling. They are not simply captives. Many of them seem relieved to have abandoned the burden of choosing. Doom's promise is terrifying because it offers peace through erasure. Conan's opposite problem is that he cannot surrender. Not even to healing, not even to love, at least not fully. He is too bound to memory, too shaped by survival, too inwardly loyal to the child who lost everything. Where Doom's followers give themselves away, Conan holds himself with almost painful intensity. He refuses to dissolve into someone else's belief, but refusal alone is not freedom. A clenched fist is still a kind of prison. Valeria matters because she represents the possibility of a life not organized around the past. She is not innocent, and that is important. She is not a symbol of purity entering a corrupted world. She belongs to danger as much as Conan does. But she knows how to choose life inside danger. She knows pleasure, movement, partnership, and risk without turning all of it into revenge. Through her, the film asks whether Conan could become something other than the one that made him. That question gives the love story its meaning. It is not powerful because it is deeply developed in a conventional romantic sense. It is powerful because of what it interrupts. For a short time, Conan is not only moving toward doom, he is with someone. He is seen, he is desired, he is matched. Valeria's presence suggests that survival does not have to end in isolation. It can open toward loyalty. It can open toward laughter. It can open toward a future, even one built by thieves and warriors. But the tragedy is that the past remains louder, and this is where the film's symbols begin to gather. The wheel, the sword, the serpent, the cult, the fire, the empty landscapes, they are all images of transformation. The wheel transforms a child into a warrior. The sword transforms memory into action. The serpent transforms religion into threat and seduction. The cult transforms longing into obedience. Fire transforms loss into ritual. The landscape transforms the journey into ordeal. Every major image in the film asks the same question in a different form: what are you becoming, and who is shaping you? That question is the emotional core of the film. Conan is shaped first by family, then by violence, then by captivity, then by combat, then by companionship, then by love, then by grief, then finally by choice. The film's deepest movement is from being formed by the world to acting upon the world with conscious will. At the beginning, things happen to Conan. By the end, Conan acts. That sounds simple, but myth often works through simple transformations that carry enormous emotional force. The film is also saying something about masculinity, though not always with complete awareness. Conan is the image of extreme physical strength, but the story quietly reveals the sorrow underneath that strength. His body is not simply fantasy, it is evidence of what he has endured. The film sometimes celebrates power in a blunt, old fashioned way, but its best moments complicate that celebration. Strength does not protect Conan from grief. It does not make him emotionally whole. It does not give him back his parents. It does not save every person he loves. It allows him to survive, but survival is not the same as being healed. That distinction is crucial. Modern viewers may look at Conan and see only the fantasy of invincibility, but the film itself keeps showing vulnerability beneath the monument. He can be captured, he can be tempted, he can be broken, he can mourn, he can need others. The body may look like armor, but the story keeps finding the human being inside it, and that is why the film has more emotional value than its surface reputation sometimes suggests. At the same time, Conan the Barbarian is about the danger of mistaking power for meaning. Doom has power, but what he offers is emptiness dressed as revelation. Conan has power, but power alone cannot tell him what to live for. Osric has royal power, but it cannot bring his daughter back spiritually. The cult has collective power, but it requires the surrender of self. Again and again, the film shows power less incomplete unless it is connected to something true. So, what is true in this world? Not much, and that is why the few true things matter. Memory is true, loyalty is true, grief is true, chosen companionship is true, the body's record of survival is true, the refusal to give your will away is true. Love, even brief love, is true. The film does not present a gentle universe, but it does suggest that meaning exists in acts of loyalty and remembrance rather than in grand systems of domination. This is what makes the ending feel inevitable long before it arrives. Conan does not need to become a king in this film to complete the emotional arc. He needs to reclaim authority over the story of his own life. Doom turned Conan's childhood into a wound. The word turned Conan's body into a weapon. Revenge nearly turns Conan's future into a continuation of the past. The final movement must be about whether he can take all of that shaping and still make one act that belongs to him. That is why Conan the Barbarian remains interesting even when it is imperfect. Beneath the swords and temples, it is a story about formation after devastation. It asks whether a person can be more than what harmed them. It asks whether strength can become something other than reaction. It asks whether belief should be placed in steel, in gods, in leaders, in love, or in the heart one will to remain oneself. And maybe that is the part that still resonates. Most of us do not live inside mythic deserts or serpent cults or kingdoms of fire and iron, but we understand the fear of being shaped by pain. We understand the longing to face the thing that changed us. We understand the temptation to believe that one final confrontation will make us whole. And we understand somewhere deep down that becoming free is harder than becoming strong. That is what this film is really saying. Not that revenge saves you, not that steel is enough, but that a human being can be forced by suffering, guided by memory, rescued by loyalty, wounded by love, and still stand at the end asking the oldest question cinema can ask. After everything the world has made of you, what will you choose to become? To understand Conan the Barbarian as a John Milius film, you have to understand that he does not approach myth as decoration. He approaches myth as a way of organizing the world. That is the signature running underneath the film. Milius is drawn to codes, warriors, rituals, loyalty, violence, honor, strength, fate, and the strange spiritual hunger that lives inside masculine words. His characters often exist in spaces where civilization feels thin and order laws seem to rise through the cracks. The beach, the battlefield, the frontier, the ancient kingdom, these are not only settings, they are testing grounds. They reveal what people believe when comfort disappears. And Conan the Barbarian fits that instinct almost too perfectly. This is a film about a man who is not explained by society because society has failed him from childhood. Conan is shaped outside the safety of ordinary institutions. He does not become himself through school, family, community, or law. He becomes himself through force, captivity, combat, wandering, friendship, and revenge. That kind of formation belongs deeply to Milius's imagination. He is fascinated by people who are made by pressure. What makes Milius's signature so visible here is the seriousness with which he treats physical strength. In many films, strength is only spectacle, it is there to impress us. In Conan, strength is almost theological. It raises questions about belief. What is stronger, steel, flesh, will, memory, loyalty, or devotion? The film keeps circling that question through images rather than arguments. Conan's body is a result of suffering. Doom's voice is a weapon of spiritual control. Valeria's movement becomes freedom in physical form. The sword is not only a blade, it is inheritance, philosophy, and identity. That is very Milius. He likes the world to feel governed by codes, not always gentle codes, not always codes we are meant to accept without question, but systems of belief that characters live and die by. In Conan, the code begins with steel. Conan's father gives him a vision of the world where what can be forged, held, and trusted matters more than the promises of gods. Then Thulsa Doom arrives and challenges that code by showing another kind of power, the power to make others surrender their own will. The film's drama is not just revenge. It is one belief system clashing with another. Visually, Milius's signature appears in the way he frames bodies as monuments. Conan is often photographed less like a casual human being and more like a figure from sculpture, mural, or myth. He stands against fire, stone, sky, and dust. He is not always psychologically close to us, but he is visually immense. That choice can create distance, but it also gives the film its iconic force. Milius wants us to see Conan as a man and symbol at the same time. There is also a strong ritual quality in the direction. Many scenes feel staged as ceremonies of power, the forging of steel, the wheel, the pit, the tower, the cult gatherings, the funeral. The final confrontation. These moments are not filmed only as plot events, they feel like rites of passage. Each one transforms Conan or reveals the world more clearly. This is one of the film's clearest artistic instincts. Life is not presented as ordinary motion, but as a sequence of trials. That is why the film does not move like a standard adventure. Milius is less interested in clean narrative speed than in mythic accumulation. He wants each chapter to feel like another mark carved into Conan's identity. This can make the film feel heavy or uneven, but it also separates it from simpler fantasy entertainment. The movie has the rhythm of an old saga, where the important thing is not just what happens next, but what the happening turns a person into. Within Milius's body of work, Conan the Barbarian feels like both a continuation and a purification of his obsessions. It gives him a world where his interest in warriors, courts, fate, and violence can be expressed without modern realism getting in the way. The Hyborian age becomes almost a laboratory for his imagination. There are no ordinary social masks here. People review themselves through allegiance, courage, appetite, fear, betrayal, and worship. Everything is stripped down to elemental force. But that is also where his limitations show. A filmmaker drawn so intensely to strength can sometimes underexplore softness. A filmmaker fascinated by mythic masculinity can sometimes let women become symbols before they become fully interior people. A filmmaker who loves quotes can sometimes make the world feel narrower than life itself. Conan has all of these tensions. Its power comes from Milius's commitment to men, but some of its emotional thinness comes from the same place. Still, watching this film teaches you something very clear about how Milius sees the world. He sees human beings as creatures tested by forces larger than comfort. He sees violence not merely as action but as a language cultures use to express power. He sees belief as dangerous because belief can make people noble, but it can also make them obedient. He sees myth as something alive, not something childish. And he sees the body as a record of history. That last point may be the key. In Conan the Barbarian, the body remembers what the mouth does not say. Conan's body remembers slavery, labor, battle, hunger, desire, grief, and survival. Valeria's body remembers freedom through motion. Doom's body barely needs to move because his power has migrated into voice and presence. This is a filmmaker thinking through physical form. So, when we talk about the filmmaker's signature, we are really talking about a worldview, harsh, romantic, sometimes blunt, sometimes limited, but undeniably strong. Milius makes Conan feel like a myth because he believes myth is one of cinema's natural languages. He believes a sword can carry philosophy, a landscape can carry loneliness, a ritual can reveal a civilization, a warrior can be both damaged man and ancient symbol, and whether you fully connect with that vision or resist part of it, the signature is unmistakable. This is not anonymous fantasy. This is John Milius looking at Robert E. Howard's Barbarian and seeing not just adventure, but a question carved into steel. What remains of a person when the world strips life down to pain, power, loyalty, and will? What changes on rewatches that Conan the Barbarian becomes less about surprise and more about pattern? The first time through, you may watch it as a journey. The child, the wheel, the warrior, the thief, the lover, the avenger. You follow the events as they arrive. But the second time, knowing where the story is going, the film begins to feel more circular than linear. It is always returning to the same wound. It is always asking Conan to face a different version of the same question. What has power made of you, and what will you do with the power you now carry? The opening becomes heavier on rewatch because you no longer see it only as origin. You see it as a curse that the entire film is spent trying to answer. Conan's father speaking about steel feels different once you know that Thulsa Doom will later challenge that belief. What first sounds like a simple lesson from parent to child becomes the beginning of a philosophical conflict. Steel is not just a weapon, it is a worldview. It is what Conan inherits before he inherits grief. The wheel of pain also becomes more tragic the second time. At first, it is unforgettable because of the transformation. The boy becomes the man. The image is powerful, almost mythic, but on rewatch, the horror of it deepens. You are no longer impressed only by the body being built, You are more aware of the years being stolen. The field is not a training ground, it is a machine of disappearance. It turns childhood into muscle, time into captivity, and suffering into usefulness. That is one of the film's cruelest ideas. The same world that damages Conan also gives him the tools to survive it. On a rewatch, you feel the sadness inside that contradiction more clearly. His strength is not pain victory over pain, it is pain converted into form. And once you understand that, Schwarzenegger's stillness begins to read differently. What may have seemed limited at first can begin to feel like a man whose inner life was never allowed to grow in ordinary ways. The details around Thulsa Doom also sharpen. The first time he is the villain Conan must find, the second time he becomes the film's shadow philosophy. He is present even when absent because his influence is everywhere, in fear, in worship, in the way people surrender themselves to spectacle and belief. His calmness becomes more disturbing when you know how deeply his power depends on the weakness of others. He does not simply conquer bodies, he convinces people that surrender is transcendence. Valeria gains power on rewatch because you know what she interrupts. The first time she may seem like a thrilling companion and romantic force. The second time she becomes the clearest sign that Conan might have had another life. Every moment of joy with her carries a quiet sorrow because you already feel the shadow of loss approaching. Her presence becomes not only exciting but fragile. She is the path not taken, the possible future that revenge cannot fully allow him to choose. Subotai also becomes more important the second time. His friendship with Conan is easy to underplay because the film does not overstate it, but on rewatch, the small gestures matter more. The loyalty, the humor, the practical care, the willingness to remain beside someone whose destiny is dangerous. In a film filled with domination, friendship becomes almost sacred because it is freely given. Nobody hypnotizes Sabotage into loyalty. Nobody owns it. He chooses it. The wizard's narration also feels different, with memory. The film begins to feel less like something happening now and more like a legend being preserved because someone believes it deserves to survive. That framing changes the roughness of the storytelling. The gaps, the simplicity, even the strange pacing can begin to feel like features of oral myth. Not everything is explained because legends do not always explain, they remember what burns brightest. Some weaknesses remain on rewatch, in fact, a few become clearer. The underwritten characters remain underwritten, the pacing still drifts in places. Certain images still carry the limitations of the era. Rewatching does not magically fix the film, but it does reveal that the movie has a stronger internal rhythm than it may first appear to have. Its repetitions are not accidental. Steer, pain, worship, fire, and silence keep returning because the film is built almost like a chant. The ending also gains weight when you know how early it was prepared. Conan's final confrontation with Doom is not just an action payoff, it is the answer to the father's lesson. The whale's cruelty, Valeria's love, Doom's philosophy, and Conan's own unfinished becoming. On rewatch, the film feels less like it is asking whether Conan will defeat his enemy and more like it is asking what kind of belief will remain standing when the force god falls. That is why the film gains more than it loses on rewatch. The surprise is not the point, the accumulation is the point. You begin to notice how often the camera lets objects carry meaning, how often the music reveals emotion before the script does, how often Conan is surrounded by people who either use power, surrender to power, or help him understand power differently. The second viewing makes the film feel sadder, slower perhaps but sadder. You see the boy inside the warrior more clearly. You see the wound beneath the fantasy more clearly. You see that the whole film is not only about becoming strong enough to kill a monster, it is about becoming human enough not to become one. Conan the Barbarian did not rise out of nothing. It feels ancient because it is built from many older cinematic and literary bones: pulp adventure, mythic epic, silent visual storytelling, sword and sandal spectacle, western loneliness, samurai severity, and the old human desire to watch a lone figure cross a dangerous world with only a weapon, a wound, and a code. The most obvious ancestor is Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories. Howard's creation came from pulp imagination, from a world where civilization often feels temporary and barbarism is not simply savagery, but a kind of raw vitality set against corruption, decadence, and forced refinement. The film does not adapt its world in a completely literary way. It changes, compresses, and reshapes, but it keeps the essential fantasy. A man outside civilization moving through kingdoms that are often more rotten than the wildness they fear. That idea matters because Conan the Barbarian is not only asking us to admire strength, it is asking us to look at civilization suspiciously. In this film, temples can be corrupt, palaces can be powerless, wealth can be hollow, religion can become manipulation. The so called barbarian is not innocent, but he is often less false than the systems around him. That tension comes from older adventure traditions, where the outsider reveals the sickness of the world he enters. You can also feel the shadow of sword and sandal cinema, the grand historical spectacles and mythological adventures that filled screens decades earlier. Those films loved bodies, temples, crowds, rituals, gods, chains, thrones, and heroic suffering. Conan inherits that visual vocabulary, but it darkens it. The older spectacles often aimed for grandeur, pageantry, and heroic moral clarity. Conan takes similar ingredients and makes them harsher, dirtier, stranger. Its temples do not shine with divine order, they sweat with fear. Its rulers are not always noble, its rituals feel dangerous rather than majestic. There's also something of the biblical epic in its scale, though stripped of spiritual certainty. The film understands the power of processions. Sacred objects follow us, prophecies, and punishment. But instead of a clear moral universe ruled by divine justice, Conan gives us a world where gods are distant and people must decide what to believe, with very little help from heaven. That absence makes the film feel colder. It borrows the shape of sacred cinema, then fills it with doubt. The influence of the Western is just as important. Conan often moves like a frontier figure, a man of few words crossing open land toward violence that feels personal and inevitable. The landscapes are not just scenery, they are tests. Like many Western heroes, he exists between savagery and civilization, belonging fully to neither. He is not comfortable inside society, but he is not merely a beast outside it. He is a survivor moving through spaces where law feels weak and reputation, skill, and courage matter more than official authority. This is why some of the film's strongest images feel almost like a Western translated into myth. Riders crossing open terrain, a warrior framed against the horizon, a group of companions approaching danger, a final reckoning shaped less like a battle plan and more like fate arriving on foot. The sword replaces the gun, the desert kingdom replaces the frontier town, but the emotional structure remains familiar. A wounded outsider moving toward the confrontation that has been waiting for him since the beginning. There is also a samurai severity in the film's relationship to discipline, weapons, silence, and ritual. Not because Conan simply copies samurai cinema, but because it shares with that tradition a respect for stillness before violence. The weapon is not only an object, it carries philosophy. The warrior is not only a fighter, he is a body trained by history. The moment before action can matter as much as action itself. When Conan holds a sword, the film wants us to feel the weight of a life organized around that object. And then there is the influence of visual storytelling from silent cinema. Conan the Barbarian often works best when you could almost remove the dialogue and still understand the emotional movement. A child loses home, a wheel turns, a body changes, a tomb opens, a sword is taken, a woman burns in memory, a false god stands before his followers. These are images built for immediate comprehension. The film trusts shape, gesture, and composition. It knows that before cinema became a medium of words, it was a medium of faces, bodies, shadows, and motion. That is part of why the film feels different from later fantasy. Later fantasy often leans on lore, explanation, prophecy, maps, names, and systems. Conan belongs to an older mode. It wants to feel like a fragment of legend, not a complete encyclopedia. It joins a conversation with mythic cinema that believes mystery is not a flaw. The unknown can make the world larger, the unexplained can make the story feel older. At the same time, Conan arrives after the great shift caused by blockbuster world building. It knows audiences were ready for invented worlds, but it refuses the brightness of space adventure. Where other films of the era turned fantasy toward wonder, Conan turns it toward endurance. It takes the appetite for cinematic myth and drags it through mud, blood, smoke, and ritual fire. That is its transformation of what came before. It does not invent the heroic journey, the revenge tale, the warrior myth, or the corrupt kingdom. It makes them feel physically punishing. You can also sense the influence of operatic cinema, not opera in the literal sense, but in the way music enlarges emotion beyond realism. Basil Poladier's score makes the film feel descended from stories that were sung before they were written. This connects Conan to older epic traditions where music does not simply support story but gives story its spiritual temperature. The score tells us when the film is mourning, when it is invoking legend, when it is turning violence into ritual memory. What Conan the Barbarian says that some earlier heroic cinema did not or could not is that the hero's strength may itself be a scar. Older adventure stories often present strength as destiny or virtue. This film presents strength as something created by suffering. Conan is not born whole into heroism, he is damaged into power. That idea makes the myth darker. It turns the heroic body into evidence of loss. So the cinema before this film is everywhere inside it. Pulp pages, ancient epics, sword and sandal spectacle, western solitude, samurai silence, silent cinema imagery, and blockbuster era world hunger. But Conan does not merely repeat those influences, it melts them down and forges them into something rougher. A myth with dirt under its nails, a fantasy that feels older than comfort, a heroic story where the blade shines but the wound underneath it matters more. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. The full shape of Conan the Barbarian only reveals itself when we look directly at its ending, because this is where the film's rough simplicity becomes clearest and most meaningful. The story begins with Conan losing everything to Thulsa Doom, and it ends with Conan standing before that same force, not as a slave, not as a slave, not as a pit fighter, not as a thief, but as someone who has finally gathered enough of himself to answer the wound. But the important thing is that the final answer is not only physical victory, it is not only the defeat of an enemy. It is the collapse of a false god. That is what makes Lizardo more than a revenge target. He is the man connected to Conan's childhood destruction, yes, but by the end he has become something even larger and more poisonous, a spiritual ruler whose power depends on the surrender of other people's will. He does not simply dominate through weapons, he dominates through belief. He convinces people that obedience is meaning, that surrender is transcendence, that giving up the self is the path to something greater. So when Conan moves toward Doom in the final act, he is moving toward the deepest question the film has been asking all along. What is stronger, steel or the human will? Before that final answer, the film gives Conan one of his most painful losses. Valera dies because the word of Thulsa Doom reaches into the possibility of a different life and destroys it. Her death matters because she was not merely a companion in her adventure. She was the sign that Conan's life could become larger than revenge. She represented a future where danger remained, but where the past did not have to be the only force guiding him. Through Valerio, Conan briefly touches something like chosen life. And then she is taken. The funeral scene is one of the film's most emotionally successful moments because it does not need much language. Fire does the speaking. Conan's grief is not explained in a modern way, but the image carries the feeling. Valeria becomes flame, memory, promise, and absence. The film understands that some losses cannot be processed inside the moment they happen. They simply enter the body and change the next action. What makes this death especially important is that it transforms Conan's revenge. Before Valeria, his pursuit of Doom is rooted in childhood memory. After Valeria, it becomes layered with fresh grief. Doom is no longer only the destroyer of Conan's past. He has now reached into Conan's possible future. That makes the final confrontation feel less like a straight line from opening wound to closing punishment, and more like the convergence of everything Conan has lost. But the film also gives Valeria a mythic return, and this choice is very telling. Her presence in battle, whether we read it as spiritual intervention, vision, legend, or the film's own mythic logic, turns love into protection. In a harsh realist film, that would simply remove her. Here, because the story operates as myth, death changes her form. She becomes memory made active. She becomes a promise she made through action rather than ordinary speech. She becomes proof that loyalty can outlast the body. This is one of the few places where the film's blunt mythic mode becomes emotionally beautiful. It does not ask us to believe in a detailed theology. It asks us to feel that love, once truly given, does not disappear in the same way power disappears. Doom's followers surrender themselves to an empty master. Valeria gives her sin loyalty, and that loyalty returns as strength. The contrast is simple but powerful. The final battle before Doom's downfall is important because Conan cannot win alone. That is easy to miss if we reduce the film to the image of one warrior with a sword. Conan's survival depends on companionship, planning, memory, and sacrifice. Subotai remains beside him. The wizard assists him. Valier's presence returns in another form. The man who began as isolated damage is now surrounded by bonds. In a world where Thulsa Doom builds obedience, Conan survives because of really chosen loyalty. That difference matters. Doom gathers followers by weakening the self. Conan gathers allies not by command but through shared danger, respect, and love. He does not create a cult around himself. He does not promise transcendence. He does not ask anyone to kneel. Those who stand beside him do so because they have seen him, not because they have been hypnotized by him. Film's moral contrast is not complicated, but it is clear. Domination takes, loyalty gives. Then comes the final movement toward Doom's temple, and here the film becomes less interested in combat than in revelation. Doom's power depends on theater. He needs the ceremony, the followers, the elevated position, the atmosphere of sacred authority. His rule is staged, it is performance turned into religion. The followers look toward him as if he holds the answer to the emptiness inside them, and this is where Conan's revenge becomes symbolic. He is not simply entering a room to kill a man, he is entering a belief system to break its image. The ending works because Doom tries, even then, to control Conan through the same force he uses on others. He appeals to identity, memory, spiritual authority, and the strange hunger people have for a father, a master, a meaning outside themselves. He understands that Conan is still wounded. He understands that the child inside the warrior is still searching for the thing that explains his life. And Doom, in his final manipulation, tries to place himself inside that emptiness. That is horrifying because Doom's greatest weapon has always been interpretation. He takes pain and tells people what it means. He takes longing and gives it a false direction. He takes fear and turns it into obedience. If Conan accepts Doom's final claim over meaning, then even killing him would not be enough. Doom would still have defined him. So Conan's final act is not only violent closure, it is refusal. He refuses to let Doom own the story of his life. He refuses to let the destroyer become the father. He refuses to let the false prophet turn trauma into worship. He refuses to let the man who shattered his childhood rename that shattering as destiny. And in that refusal, steel finally becomes what his father once suggested it could be. Not merely a weapon, but an extension of will. But the film has complicated steel enough that the moment does not feel simplistic. Conan's sword matters, but the sword alone is not the whole answer. The whole answer is Conan's choice. Steel without will is only metal. Will without memory is directionless. Memory without loyalty becomes obsession. The final act matters because all of these things come together. Conan acts with steel, guided by memory, strengthened by loyalty, and hardened by the refusal to surrender himself. The image of Doom's followers after the fall is just as important as the act itself. Their belief collapses because their god has been made mortal. The spell breaks, the crowd disperses, and this may be the film's sharpest statement about false power. Once the image is broken, those who worshipped it are left facing the emptiness they try to escape. Doom's followers do not receive a grand explanation, they simply lose the center of their illusion. There is something deeply lonely about that. The film does not celebrate them cruelly. It shows how fragile collective belief can be when it has been built around performance instead of truth. They came looking for meaning, and they found a man who used that hunger. When he falls, the structure around him cannot survive. It was never faith, it was dependence. And then Conan burns the temple. That act feels like more than destruction. It is purification, release, and rejection all at once. The fire echoes earlier fire, especially the fire that consumed his childhood world and the fire of Valeria's farewell. But now the fire belongs to Conan's action. At the beginning, fire is what happens to him. At the end, fire is something he uses to end the power of what harmed him. The symbol has changed hands. This is how the film closes the circle without making it too neat. Conan cannot bring back his parents. He cannot restore his village. He cannot return to childhood. He cannot undo Valeria's death. He cannot become untouched. The victory does not erase loss, it only stops the wound from being controlled by the one who made it. That is a much more honest ending than simple triumph. There are hidden details that become clearer once the film ends. The father's lesson about steel prepares the final confrontation, but not in the obvious way. The wig prepares Conan's body, but the story shows that the body alone would not be enough. Valeria's love prepares the soul for loyalty beyond survival. Subotai's friendship prepares the idea that Conan's life is no longer solitary. Doom's cult prepares the final revelation that power without truth is theater. Everything has been moving toward this collapse of false meaning, and there is no modern post-credits scene waiting to redirect the experience into franchise machinery. The film does not end by teasing the next chapter in the way contemporary blockbusters often do. Its significance lives in the final image and the legendary frame around Conan's future. We are left with the sense that this man will continue beyond the story, that kingship and age and further battles may wait somewhere ahead, but this particular wound has reached its answer. That restraint helps the ending. The film does not need to explain every future detail because Conan has already become myth. A myth does not close like a normal biography. It leaves a figure burning in memory. The final suggestion of Conan's future feels like a carved image from another age, as if the story we have watched is only one chapter from a larger saga that history will only partially remember. My personal emotional reaction to the ending is mixed, but in a way that suits the film. It is satisfying because Doom falls and Conan reclaims agency. It is sad because the victory comes after too much damage. It is powerful because the false god is revealed as mortal. It is lonely because Conan's revenge does not give him back the life that was taken. The ending understands something essential. Revenge can close a door, but it cannot rebuild a home. That is why the final image of Conan matters. He does not feel healed in a complete sense. He feels changed. There is a difference. Healing would suggest restoration. Change suggests survival with scars. Conan has passed through fire, steel, enslavement, love, grief, and revenge, and what remains is not innocence, but identity. He knows who he is more fully because he has faced the force that tried to define him. And here the film's deepest meaning returns. Conan the Barbarian is not truly saying that strength solves pain. It is saying that strength without selfhood is incomplete. Doom has influence, but no truth. His followers have devotion, but no freedom. Conan has power, but he must learn what that power is for. Valeria has courage, and through her the film suggests that love can become a force even in a brutal world. Sobotai has clarity, and through him the film suggests that survival is less empty when shared. The ending brings all of that together in a rough, mythic, imperfect way. It is not subtle, it is not psychologically delicate, but it is clear in the way old stories are clear. A false god rises. A wounded child becomes a warrior. The warrior almost loses himself to the wound. Love interrupts him. Death deepens him. Loyalty saves him. Steel answers the lie. Fire cleans the temple. The crowd wakes from its dream. And somewhere beyond the smoke, Conan remains, not free of pain, not restored to what he was, but no longer owned by the man who made him suffer. That is the victory the film can give him, not peace, not innocence, not a gentle future, just the right to carry his own story forward. What Conan the Barbarian leaves behind in me is not the violence. It is not even the sword, though the sword is impossible to forget. It is not the scale of the temples, the desert roads, the cult imagery, or the heavy beauty of the score, though all of those things remain somewhere in the mind like carved symbols. What stays with me most is the image of a human being who has been shaped by pain so completely that strength becomes both his survival and his sadness. That is the feeling I carry after the credits. Not excitement exactly, not simple admiration, something quieter than that, a kind of ache. Because Conan, as this film imagines him, is not a hero who rises because the world believes in him. He rises because the world uses him, wounds him, hardens him, and still fails to erase the part of him that remembers. And there's something deeply lonely in that. The film's fantasy surface is huge, but the emotional center is almost painfully small. A child loses home, and a man spends the rest of the story trying to answer that loss with the only language the world has taught him. The single moment that has not left me is the Wheel of Pain, not because it is spectacular in the usual sense, but because it is one of those images that explains a life without explaining it. A circle, a body, time passing without mercy, the boy disappearing into the man. Every turn of that wheel feels like a year taken, a softness removed, a future narrowed, and what makes it tragic is that the result is impressive. Conan becomes powerful, but the film never fully lets that power feel innocent. That image changes how I see the entire movie. Every time Conan stands strong later, the wheel is still there in the background. Every victory carries the memory of how he was made capable of winning. Every act of violence carries the question of whether he is choosing freely or still moving through the circle that captivity is inside him. And that is why the film's roughness does not fully weaken its emotional hold. Even when it is uneven, even when it is blunt, that central image keeps echoing. It also makes me think about how often people mistake survival for healing. Conan survives. There is no question about that. He becomes physically extraordinary. He defeats enemies. He earns loyalty. He loves. He avenges. He continues. But survival is not the same as being restored. The film never gives him back the child he was. It never gives him a home in the ordinary sense. It gives him identity, but identity built from ruins. And maybe that is why the ending feels more solemn than triumphant. I would return to this film, but not because it is flawless. I would return because it has a temperature I do not find often. It feels made from stone, smoke, drums, and old wounds. It has passages where cinema becomes almost breathable, where image and music carry something more direct than dialogue. It reminds me that movies do not always need to be smooth to be memorable. Sometimes they need to have a shape strong enough to survive their own imperfections, and Conan the Barbarian has that shape. It is a film that understands the power of an image. It understands that a sword found in a tomb can feel like inheritance, that fire can feel like farewell, that a silent face can contain a childhood, that a villain can be frightening not because he is loud, but because he knows how to turn longing into obedience. It understands that myth is not just about gods and warriors. Myth is about making human pain large enough that we can look at it from a distance and finally recognize it. Did it change how I see something? Maybe it changed how I see strength in this kind of cinema. Because strength here is not only fantasy. It is not only wish fulfillment, it is also evidence. Evidence of what the body has endured, evidence of what the world demanded, evidence that sometimes the qualities people admire in a survivor were formed by experiences no one should have had to survive. That thought stays with me, and it makes Conan feel more human than he first appears. Behind the iconic body, behind the sword, behind the poster image, there is a figure who has almost no ordinary language for tenderness. Yet he still recognizes loyalty. He still responds to love. He still grieves. He still refuses to surrender his will to a false god. That is where the film finds its strange dignity. It does not make Conan gentle, but it allows us to understand why gentleness is difficult for him. The person who will carry this film after the credits is someone who loves cinema as atmosphere, not only as plot, someone who can forgive rough edges when a film has genuine identity, someone who responds to mythic images, physical words, and music that seems to rise from beneath the earth. Someone who understands that fantasy can be serious without being perfect, and that a simple story can still hold complicated feeling when the images are strong enough. But more than that, this film is David people who know what it means to be shaped by something they did not choose. Not in the literal way Conan is shaped, of course, but emotionally, spiritually, privately. People who understand that the past can become a wheel inside you. People who understand that becoming strong can sometimes mean carrying sadness more quietly. People who know that defeating the thing that hurt you does not always ruin what was taken, but it may give you back the right to move forward without being owned by it. That is what Conan the Barbarian leaves behind in me. Not the fantasy of being unstoppable. The harder, lonelier idea that a person can be wounded into strength and then spend the rest of life trying to make that strength mean something more than the wound. So, where does Conan the Barbarian finally stand when the smoke clears? For me, it stands as an imperfect myth with a powerful shadow, not a perfect fantasy film, not a perfectly balanced adventure, not a film where every character is explored as deeply as they could be, or every sequence moves with the dramatic sharpness it deserves. But it is a film with a soul made of fire and iron, and that matters. It has something many cleaner, faster, more polished films never quite achieve. A feeling that cannot be mistaken for anything else. This is a movie for people who love atmosphere, for people who consider it silence, ritual, landscape, and music, for people who understand that cinema is not always about how smoothly a story moves, but sometimes about the images it burns into you. If you need fast pacing, constant dialogue, modern emotion and clarity, or fantasy that explains every corner of its world, this may feel distant. It may feel too blunt, too slow, too severe, too locked inside its own mythic seriousness. But if you can meet it on its own terms, there is something here. There is the loneliness of a child turned into a weapon. There is the danger of false belief. There is the strange sadness of strength built from suffering. There is Valeria bringing movement and life into a world of stone. There is Thulsa Doom, calm and poisonous, understanding that the most dangerous rulers do not only control bodies, they control meaning. And above all, there is Basil Bolidor's score, lifting the film beyond its roughness into something almost ceremonial. Would I call it essential cinema? In its genre, yes, because its influence and identity are impossible to ignore. Would I call it flawless? No. Its emotional world is sometimes thinner than its visual world. Its vibrant deserve more interior life. Its pacing can feel heavy in ways that are not always purposeful, and its pulp instincts sometimes reveal the limitations of the era that produced it. But still, cinema rarely tries what this film attempts with such total seriousness. It takes a character who could have become only a physical icon and places him inside a world of grief, belief, ritual, and silence. It does not always reach the depths it wants, but it reaches with conviction, and sometimes conviction is what makes an imperfect film last. So for me, Conan the Barbarian earns a 6.4 out of 10. That rating means I respect it more than I completely love it. I admire its atmosphere, its music, its mythic imagery, and its unforgettable physical presence. I also feel its gaps, its stiffness, and the places where its emotional simplicity becomes limitation. But the final truth is this: I would rather watch an imperfect film with a strong sword than a perfect looking film with no memory. And Conan the Barbarian has memory. It remembers the wheel, it remembers the sword, it remembers the fire, it remembers the child beneath the warrior, and when it ends, it does not leave you with comfort. It leaves you with a figure shaped by loss, standing somewhere between man and legend, carrying forward the only thing the world could not fully take from him: the right to decide what his suffering will mean. And maybe that is the last shot this film truly deserves. Not a clean victory, not a soft peace, but a warrior fading into myths, still marked by the past, still walking toward whatever waits beyond the smoke. And if you stayed with me through this full journey into Conan the Barbarian, thank you, truly. This is the kind of film that asks for patience, and it asks for a different kind of attention. Not just the attention we give to plot, but the attention we give to symbols, silence, atmosphere, and the old cinematic language of bodies moving through firelight. If this essay gave you a new way to think about the film or helped you see something in it that you had not felt before, leave a like. It helps this channel continue reaching people who love cinema not just as entertainment but as experience. And I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you see Conan the Barbarian as a great fantasy film, or more as an iconic but uneven cult classic? What moment has stayed with you the longest, the wheel, the score, Valeria, Thulsa Doom, the ending, or something else entirely? And do you think Conan's story is ultimately about revenge, survival, or the search for identity after loss? If you want more cinematic essays like this, thoughtful, emotional, and willing to sit with films beyond the surface, subscribe to the Cineflux. There are more journeys coming, more films to rediscover, and more stories waiting to be looked at with patience and feeling. Next time, we will step into another world of cinema and ask the same question we always return to here, not only what happens in the film, but what the film understands. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.